Welcome, Venkatesh, and welcome everyone. Uh, this is a very special moment now because Venkatesh, I know him from so many years, and we again reconnected few days back. And it is so kind of him to have agreed to, share his time and his thoughts and insight on this wonderful topic. So he has been a crusader and a passionate evangelist for open source throughout his career, and that's how I remember him. So I just wanted to quickly set the context for this session, and then Venkatesh can just take up the session. So welcome, Venkatesh, once again, and it's really a pleasure to host you. And it would be really good if you can also come over sometime and at our office and inspire the young minds. Right. So, guys, just to set the context, we know that open source as a model, it knows no boundary, and it is a source of innovation happening in almost every field, whether it is technical, whether it is business. Now you have model where the way the crowdsourcing also works, and you try to solve problems. So, for example, just look at the way during the COVID times, how people have come together, crowdsource the information, and it is sort of the way how the open source community and the entire community works together. So it is very inspiring to know that the open source model is getting applied not only to the technology field but to almost to solve the problem which we are facing day-to-day problems. A lot of new ideas and innovations are seeing light of the day because we have open source model available to us. So this model not only promotes innovation, innovative mindset, new kind of thinking, but above all, it also enables learning on your own. So you can experiment on your own. You can actually give meaning to your thoughts and ideas and create something which is there for the entire world to use and enhance further. And this model is very amenable to the kind of working that we are seeing today. Work from home, collaborative working, and this is how the open source community works. People are sitting all over the globe, all over the world, and they are collaborating on with each other. And this is how we, as an industry now, because of the COVID and work from home, are also doing. Now, recently, my colleague Shubham also he took a session as an alma mater to his GV Pant University, where he shared a lot of insights and experience of the real world and helped the students in motivating those students to experiment with open source and create their own path. As an organization, we also are committed to open source and we support it wholeheartedly. The current session is one step ahead in this direction. And many of you would be knowing our journey of open source so far as an India's first open source integration company. And we started to way back in 2001. It was a very new phenomenon, and we realized that this is the model which is going to take and disrupt the market by storm. And this is a much better way of creating and distributing software. And our involvement with the open source community dates back in 2003-4 when we got engaged with the UK authority initiatives on open source, where along with Red Hat, we created an open source content management system called Applause, which is accessible and personalized local authority website. It was a CMS which was created as an open source contribution along with London Borough of Camden, and it became a full project in itself. Uh, then we realized that this is the model to go forward, and we started working with some of the leading banks like HDFC Bank, Yes Bank, Indian Air Force, United Nations Development Program, and many others. And we continue to work with many large customers, helping them innovate with open source. So this is the model we understand pretty well, and we are fully committed. Our teams have also contributed in many of the open source initiatives, and many of our people have written books around it. So this movement inside the organization is also thriving. So with this, I just wanted to introduce our guest of today, Venkatesh, who is India's representative of the Open Invention Network, OIN. It is an organization that protects the open source community from patent litigation. And during the presentation, Venkatesh will also share a little bit about the organization and his involvement. So Venkatesh comes from more than 30 plus years of experience in journalism and public policy with organizations like Indian Express, IIT Bangalore, Red Hat, Google, iSpirit, and the Data Governance Network at IDFC Institute. In his engagement with these organizations, he has been involved in key policy issues like promoting the use of open source in government. Now, this is one area we would like to talk a little bit more about in our session, and then also promoting open standards, India language computing, free speech, and building and evangelizing digital public goods, and many others. So let us start this session and learn from his interest in open source and how it is helping the overall community and the innovation. So over to you, Venkatesh. Thanks once again for sparing your time with us.
Thanks, Vineet. I think it's a real pleasure to reconnect with you after a long time. And I remember we used to meet quite often during the Red Hat days. And it's also a pleasure to talk to your team about open source and where it has come, because a lot of us don't realize how far we have come in the open source journey. I think I joined Red Hat in 2004, but around 2000, I started a non-profit along with Prakash Advani, who was, running a... Yeah. So Prakash basically helped fund a non-profit that we called IndLinux, IndLinux. And our goal was that, we wanted to ensure that people are able to use computers in their own language. So we started localizing Linux to Indian languages. Today, if you download Ubuntu or Fedora or any other distribution of Linux, you will get a choice of some 17 Indian languages that you can customize the user interface to. And a lot of it is, the work that we had started off at that point in time. Unfortunately, Linux did not take off on the desktop. So, but I think from those days when we started in Linux, and then, in Red Hat from 2004 onwards, we were talking to the Indian government on, why India should use Linux and open source. In the early days, when we went to the government, there was a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of fear about open source. Our proprietary software competitors who had, a lot more resources on the ground, spread a lot of fear and doubt about open source and said, oh, if it is open, it cannot be secure, etc., etc. But today, you see that open source is everywhere. So this particular photograph, I had given this presentation to HDFC Bank, and this was, just before the Mars rover, the helicopter on the Mars rover took off. So this is, so the Mars rover runs on Linux. they sent a helicopter along with the Mars rover that also runs on Linux. So I think it's just unbelievable how far Linux and open source have come. And I'll get into why this has happened. But just to give you a picture, many people who are in open source, who are deeply into open source, also sometimes do not understand the extent to which open source has grown and has spread in the ecosystem. So actually, this picture is one of the first pictures that the Mars helicopter sent back from Linux. And as a technology geek, it's something that, it's a picture of mud, but it's still the fact that it went millions of kilometers and took a picture and sent it back from outer space. It's just incredible. So let's take a look at, where is open source today? Today, if you go to top500.org, which is a website that compiles a list of all the top supercomputers in the world. And if you select operating system and check how many of them are running on Linux, you'll find that almost all of them are running on Linux. Say about 10 years ago, the situation was very different. We used to have these operating systems called Cray and others, which were proprietary operating systems. And they were all, so they were almost like, 30, 40, 50% of the top 500 supercomputer operating systems. Today, Japan's Fugaku is the world's fastest supercomputer, 7.6 million cores, all of it running on Linux. If you look at the early history of Google, Facebook, Amazon, Flipkart, you'll find that, from day one, they were all using Linux and open source. Of course, this may not be news to you, but it's news to a lot of people. If you look at all the Android phones, so we lost the battle on the desktop for a bunch of reasons. But I think on mobile phones with Android, it was completely running on Linux. Then if you look at all the major e-government projects in India, if you look at Aadhaar, UPI, there is a new system called the account aggregator that is coming in. It's all running on Linux. Many years ago, there must have been about maybe 10 years ago, when the goods and service tax network was being launched, I met with the launch team of GST and spoke to them and I asked them, why are you using Linux and open source? And they said, see, we are the government of India. We are running a project which is some $300 million, and money is not an issue. If we need another $100 million, we can go back to the government and say, increase the budget from $300 million to $400 million. And all these proprietary software vendors are sitting outside our door, whether it's IBM, SAP, all of them are sitting outside their door and saying, use our software, we'll give you an 80% discount. So they are all kind of falling over themselves to sell their systems to us. But we are not going to use that, because we want complete technology control over the stacks that we build. And tomorrow, if we want to remove one database and swap it with another, we want that flexibility and the freedom. And we don't want to be tied into a proprietary ecosystem. So today, if you look at GST, they are swapping out an old database for a new one. Aadhaar, if you look at it, they are swapping out some old components for a new one. And this would not have been possible if they were using proprietary software. The other thing that we all have to realize is that all the new technology developments that are all happening in open source. And there is a reason for it. I'll come to that soon. So there is a model that we call collaborative innovation. And because of the internet, because on the internet, you can create communities of people. You can, aggregate humongous number of people into these communities. And then, if you have the licensing frameworks of open source, you can create these systems where, which enable people to collaborate with each other in incredibly large numbers. And collaboration is not a new thing. When the Oxford English Dictionary was created, this was in 1700s. Remember that. In 1700s, when the editors of the OED started the dictionary, they said a dictionary is a compendium of all the words in the English language, and it's too difficult for any one person to put together a compendium. So in those days, even Samuel Johnson, who was one of the most prolific lexicographer, I think that's the term for it. Even he could, just as an individual, put together only some 10,000 words and define them. So they said, let's create this thing where, people around the world can contribute. And over a period of 70 years, literally 2 tons of written material was shipped back and forth from the editors of the Oxford English Dictionary and the contributors. So now if you fast forward to something like Wikipedia, which is the closest analogy that we have to the Oxford English Dictionary, it was started in 2000, but because of the Creative Commons license that it uses and the fact that, it's on the internet and people can contribute to it, it has got 6.2 million entries in the English language alone. And if you look at all the other languages, it's got, millions and millions of entries. So the internet has really supercharged the possibilities of global collaboration. And I think I'll come back to, some of those issues down the line. If you look at the Linux kernel itself, Linus Torvalds started it as a college project. He wanted to create an operating system which was an alternative to Unix, and there was something called Minix which was not easily shareable. So he created Linux and put out, I think, roughly some 10,000 lines of code. Then somebody said, hey, can I port it to the Alpha? Can I port it to the DEC supercomputer? So people started adding more and more and more, and today it's to 27.8 billion lines of code. There is a study which was done many years ago, which said that if the Linux kernel was built using the commercial development model, it would be worth close to 10 billion lines of code, $10 billion. So just think of it, if you ask your father to borrow his car, he will probably not give it to you. But you have this source code worth about $10 billion and you can download it freely off the internet. It's just an amazing kind of a access to technology that has been democratized because of the internet and open source software. So one aspect is the internet. The other aspect is the licensing framework of open source software. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the picture is that of Richard Stallman, who is a winner of the MacArthur Genius Awards, and brilliant mathematician, a brilliant technology thinker, a little bit of an eccentric, but then, what is life without eccentrics? So Stallman basically created the general public license, which was the very opposite of copyright. So in copyright, you say, I have written this poem or I have written this code and all rights are reserved. In the general public license and the free software license, you say that all the rights are reversed, not all the rights are reserved. So it's just an inventive genius of Stallman that, he said, I don't want to, prevent you from using this software. So therefore, I am, creating this software, but I give you the right to run this program the way you want to run it. I give you the freedom to study how this program works. I give you the freedom to redistribute it. And if you modify it, you have to, and distribute it, you have to change, you have to share the improvements so that, others also benefit from the improvements. So this was the GPL license. And from there on, it kind of took off in a big way. And the licensing model really plays a big role in, the growth and success of open source and bringing it to where it is today. Now, just let's take a look at the way in which it has been used in India. So, you could argue that Aadhaar is one of the world's biggest e-government projects. 1 billion authentications and eKYCs are done in a month. The database deduplicates about 1 million entries against a database of 1.27 billion population that has been enrolled in the database. Many people said that it's impossible to write a deduplication engine that works at this scale. The UK had a biometric project which failed. And imagine, UK has a population which is probably about 100 million, 1/10 that of India. And they were not able to pull it off, but Indian technologists pulled it off. This is all because of, using open source. In fact, the entire data center for Aadhaar is housed in a 4,000 square feet location. And again, it's because of, the extreme customization that you could do because of access to open source software. And, in the UK, I think they had some estimate saying that each Aadhaar enrollment would, cost at least some £100 or something like that. In India, we have issued identity at a cost which is a fraction of that, of what the Western countries had estimated. And Reliance Jio was doing at least 1 million, authorizations and eKYCs in a day when the Jio phone was launched. And they did it roughly at the cost of some 4 rupees per transaction. So it's just incredible how, we've been able to leverage Linux and open source to, achieve these kind of price points and achieve incredible scalability and performance. So I spoke to the architects of Aadhaar, and basically they said that, and this is, you are all techies, so you will understand this. And also understand the, what this really means. When I spoke to HDFC Bank, some of the folks there were non-techies and they didn't understand what this means, But the ability to move from one database to the other, the ability to move one platform to the other is simply, unbelievable. And especially when, you're implementing technology at such a massive scale. Let's take a quick look at GST. 300,000 concurrent sessions designed for one. They're going to scale it up now to, 1.5 crore taxpayers over the next 3 years. You can just make it more horizontally scalable by adding more and more hardware. A lot of redundancy has been built in. Now, let me come to, the banking sector. I'm sure that the banking sector is one of the most, the BFSI sector is a big sector for Info Axon. DBS Bank CIO basically said that we are a technology company that also does banking. And there was an interview where he spoke about their journey, and he said that we used to be completely vendor driven. We had 80% outsourced, and in 10 years, what we have done is we completely flipped it around using open source. So the impact is basically on the bottom line is phenomenal. So from, about 55% in terms of the cost to income ratio, they brought their technology cost down to 42 cents. So this is like, this is in the banking sector, every cent matters because banks basically evaluate their cost structure based on something called the net interest margin. So they calculate every basis point. A basis point is, part of a percentage basically. So and they basically said that we have to benchmark ourselves not against other banks, but against Google, Amazon, Netflix, and other companies, because eventually we think some of them will come into the banking sector. And today, if you look at it, you see that Google Pay is becoming very prominent. They have a foothold in the payment sector, and they've now recently bought out a neo bank for about $10 million. So eventually, you will see them getting into that. And when you are using old technology which is not scalable, which is expensive, and your competitors are using technology which can scale almost infinitely, and which is a fraction of your cost, then you have no way of competing unless you adopt open source. So many banks are looking at leveraging open source now. Today, DBS has got about 350 APIs available to developers. So one of the questions that comes up in talking to people is, and this was the biggest fear, uncertainty, doubt that Microsoft and others had spread is, if the code is open, how can it be secure? I think the code being open has nothing to do with security. Security is a process, it is a methodology, it is a system, and the underlying software is only one part of it. So Eric Raymond, who was one of the pioneers, he said that many eyes make bug shallow, which meant that the more people who are seeing the code, the more people spot vulnerabilities and fix it. It works most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. And Log4j vulnerability, etc. I think people have realized that for critical infrastructure components, you need to have some systematic program to kind of reduce vulnerabilities. So what is happening now is that Google, Linux Foundation, and many others are coming together to protect Linux and open source and improve fix the security vulnerabilities in the critical technology components that we use. Also, if you look at OSS like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, it has got some very, very high security certifications, because many years ago, I remember the National Security Agency in the US worked with Red Hat to open source some critical security components, which they used to call SE Linux, Security Enhanced Linux. And those components were brought inside RHEL, and today I think it is certified at EA, I think Enterprise Architecture Level 4 or something like that. So, which is one of the highest security certifications in the US. The other thing I really want to mention is that in India, we are kind of still quite low in the open source maturity model. We are consuming open source. If you look at GitHub data, India is the third most active country after the US and China. But we are not, contributing much back to open source. Slowly, things are changing. Recently, there was news that there's a company called Hasura, Hasura, based in Bangalore, which is Bangalore and San Francisco, which raised about $100 million and became one of the first unicorns, open source unicorns out of India. So Hasura is one major open source success stories coming out of India. There are a few others. Sunbird, which is a software that is used for education, which is also supported by Nandan Nilekani and the Ekstep Foundation. That has been used by schools across India. There are other projects. So the Julia programming language, again, another organization with footprint in Bangalore and San Francisco. The Federal Aviation Administration in the US uses it extensively to manage flight paths of all the aircraft flying in the US. So I think slowly we are moving up the open source maturity model. We have been consuming open source. Slowly we are beginning to contribute back to open source, and slowly we are beginning to create our own open source projects out of India. This I created because a lot of organizations are now asking, we are using open source, we are consuming open source at a very tactical level, but how can we use open source at a more strategic level? We understand that it is critical. We understand that it can help us reduce cost, but how can we really leverage it now that we have so many open source components that we are using in our enterprise? So I think one of the suggestions is to set up an open source program office. I think you'll see that in the next few years, you'll see the government of India, you will see banks, you will see insurance companies, etc., setting up large open source program offices. And I think setting up and managing an open source program office will become a crucial job description and a highly paid job description in the next few years to come. So I would encourage all of you to start reading about it, start thinking about it. But getting more open source in the enterprise is a cultural shift. It's not just using technology. If you are just consuming open source, you are not an open source user. Unless and until you understand what it is to collaborate, what it is to build a community, what it is to build this commons, the shared ownership of knowledge. Unless and until you understand that, you are not an open source developer. You are a software developer, but you are not an open source developer unless you understand how it is to collaborate with other people, build software inside a community, and share collective ownership of that knowledge that you create. So for these organizations, and this is for example Bombay Stock Exchange, HDFC Bank, some large insurance companies, I would say start with small non-critical workloads, get your hands dirty, start contributing back to that, learn the cultural process of collaborating in open source, and also look at deeper engagement with organizations like the Linux Foundation. Sorry, I've got a bad cold, so my throat is a little hoarse. But many of these open source program, the way this success is measured is, building an open source culture within the company, developer efficiency, reach in the internal open source developers, reducing license violations, better compliance, starting to contribute code back to the open source community, the number of people in an organization contributing code back, the market adoption of projects that internal teams have developed, the number of projects that you have initiated. I think this also has a downstream effect in that, open source developers want to work in organizations that are friendly to open source. So today, almost all developers are open source developers. So I think organizations are realizing that they have to kind of, if they want to be one of the best places to work, they also have to kind of, have a very open source friendly ecosystem so that some of the best open source developers are attracted to work inside. There's a little bit about the philosophy. We saw the general public license which Richard Stallman had created. There's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who wrote a book called The Success of Open Source. And Dr. Steven Weber basically said, if you look at property in open source, it is configured around the right to share, not the right to exclude. Why is this important? I think this is really an important critical skill for humanity as a whole, not just for businesses and technologists and others. Because if you want to solve the biggest problems of our day, whether it's COVID, the next pandemic that comes along, climate change, and some of the biggest problems, we have to take a collaborative approach to sharing data, to building systems together, rather than reinventing technology again and again and again. We have to learn to share code. We have to learn to be agile in terms of creating new knowledge. And one of the examples is, for example, the COVID websites that came up, and how quickly communities came together to share data with each other. Instead of working in silos, people came together and said, we have a common purpose. Let's work together to sort it out. So, I think this is, all the biggest challenges that we face as humanity. The open source model of collaboration, community, the shared ownership of knowledge. It's a model that is going to become really, really important as days go by. I think in software development, open source is the new normal. Blockchain, big data, analytics, everything, the pace of collaborative innovation in these areas has been so rapid that that proprietary software has just not gotten a chance to make any inroads. It's another challenge that because of cloud computing, etc., companies like Amazon, etc., are using a lot of open source, but building proprietary solutions on top of it. I think it's a serious challenge that also needs to be addressed. But a little bit about what we do at Open Invention Network. Many years ago, we realized that Linux and open source are vulnerable to patent litigation, and this is about 15 years ago. So what we did is we purchased about 1,000 software patents worth about close to $100 million, and we licensed it out free of cost to everybody who said that we will join OIN and not use our patents against other OIN members for using Linux and open source. So today what we see is that 38% of all patent litigation is around software and business methods. And the reason this is a problem is, if you go to point number 1 here, property in open source is configured around the right to share. Patents are the exact opposite. Patents are the right to exclude. If I own a patent on one-click shopping, it means that I can prevent you from using that method. So you have to then do two-click shopping. If you patent two-click shopping, you have the right to prevent somebody else from using that method, and that guy has to invent a method for three-click shopping. So it goes on and on and on. So in our philosophy, we believe that by sharing knowledge, everybody benefits, and that software is an applied form of mathematics and logic. And if you cannot patent mathematics and logic, you should not be able to patent software also. So we have been for the last 15 years protecting Linux and open source users from patent litigation. In India, HDFC Bank, NPCI, which runs UPI, Reliance Jio, Zomato, Zoho, and a whole bunch of organizations are members of OIN. I want to give you some resources that you can read up, and Vineet, if you can share this presentation, all these are clickable links, and people can read more.
Yeah, I'll share that, Venkatesh.
Yeah, and I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So I'll speak a little bit about these organizations. And really sorry, my throat is very, very bad. But the Free Software Foundation and Stallman were the guys who created the GPL license. And, it's a very idealistic and a very passionate bunch of individuals. After the FSF was founded, a lot of people felt that it was not that business friendly. So they created something called the open source initiative, and the terminology of open source was a lot more acceptable to businesses. So, um, so open source became more popular as a term. They're closely related, but each of these, has very fundamentally different ideologies. The free software movement believes that all software should be free. Open source is a little bit more of a middle of the road path. So when you say that I am using open source, you have to be very clear. If you are using a software that is one of the software programs, using one of the software licenses that is approved by open source initiative, then you are using open source. If the license of the software you are using is not licensed by the open source initiative, it is not open source. So yeah, the term has a certain sanctity that you have to recognize and respect. The Software Freedom Law Center is a organization which is a law firm which was involved in creating a lot of the open source software licenses, including GPL v3. So that's an organization. I'm on the governing council of the India chapter of SFLC. FOSS United is a organization that aims to bring together the Indian free and open source software community. I would encourage you to take a look at their website, and they have a very active Telegram channel that I would encourage you to join. It's mostly full of developers, a lot of conversation around new open source tools that are coming in. It's got 1,000+ membership. It's really, really huge. So I'd encourage you to join that. And lastly, the Open Invention Network. We own about 1,000 patents. We own, and then we protect core infrastructure components of open source. Some blockchain packages, some virtualization, networking, and all these critical software components. We have about 3,500 global members, including Google, IBM. Last year, Microsoft joined us, and we have been. Our membership is basically free to any open source organization or any open source project. So if you're running an open source project, I'd encourage you to join that. Vineet, InfoAxon has not yet joined. I think one of these days you should join us soon. So that's my quick presentation. I'm going to log out of this presentation because I can't see the screen, but I'm encourage all of you to connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Gmail. And it's pleasure to kind of talk to all of you and give this presentation to you. Any questions, let me know.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Venkatesh. It was though I saw this presentation earlier, but it had a different feel to it, and it had a different meaning to it when you presented it. So it was coming straight from your heart and your experience. So it made a lot of sense, and I could relate it to lot many things, which we have been seeing when we meet customers, when we meet institutions, and the kind of mindset that we come across. So thanks for that. Thanks for sharing this. I'm sure it would have added a lot of knowledge to all the people who are there on this call, and I think they would have been motivated. And in fact, many people are not even aware of many things, and suddenly one spark here and there opens up the entire new world for them. So thanks for that. I think you would have ignited that spark. Thank you.
I think it's just amazing, that I mean, in that 2004 timeframe when we were evangelizing Linux and open source, people felt that, this model is never going to work.
Yeah.
And from there to today, where, everything is open source and, proprietary software is more the exception than the norm. It's just an incredible kind of a point in history.
Right.
So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer
Yeah.
that. I'll have to log off around, say, 5:55 or 5:56.
Sure.
Because I have another call to jump into, but happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of queries on my WhatsApp, though I'm asking them to write it here. But one thing people are asking is because you work with you mentioned you work with government and you interact them on almost daily basis. So.
Yeah.
What is your sense? Are they open to using a lot of open source? And because open source does not come from a very large organization, so it comes from everywhere. It comes from smaller organization as well. But the government policies of having some mandatory requirements for smaller companies to participate sometimes restrict them to participate in those initiatives. So are you seeing any changes there? Is it moving to a direction where everybody could participate?
I think, so I'll tell you, I think, one of the things that we have failed to do as industry is we have failed to organize ourselves and represent our points of view effectively in front of the government of India. I think, today the government of India has got a policy on open source which says that all things being equal, there are two options between a proprietary and open source option. The government will prefer the open source option. Now, we see, all of us know that, in India, we write beautiful English. But when it comes to implementation of the policy, there's a lot that needs to be done. So one of the new roles that I have is to, as a public policy advisor to FOSS United. And what we plan to do is to, become the organization that represents the FOSS community, the voice of the FOSS community with the government of India, and actively engage with the FOSS, with government of India on these issues. And these are, some of the issues that you have mentioned are pain points. Small, if a tender says that a vendor has to have a turnover of 50 crores, that precludes a FOSS company from participating in that particular tender. So I think one of the things that we need to do is work with some of the FOSS supporters in the government of India.
Yeah.
And there are many of them, and ensure that the policies are a little flexible so that we can encourage the growth of the FOSS community in India.
Right.
FOSS developers and somebody asking what does it mean to be a open source developer. I think every open source community has got its own norms. So the community will have a certain set of norms. I think what it means is to be to be able to respect the culture and the norms and the values and the license conditions of open source, work with others to build software collaboratively. The ultimate kind of a measure of success is when you have contributed code to a particular project, and then they say that are you going to become a maintainer of this project? So I think that's the value chain that people should be climbing. And the benefit there is that in proprietary software, I don't know who and if I am a developer looking to, or a CTO looking to hire people, I don't know in proprietary software who's the best person to hire. But in open source, the best person to hire is always visible. Their code contributions, you can go to GitHub and other platforms and say, this guy has contributed over the last 5 years. He's now a maintainer of this project. So that person then becomes the magnet. I think typically we have seen that developers of these projects, people who have a serious, sincere track record of contributing back to a project, there are more people chasing that guy and looking to hire him than
Yeah. In fact,
so it's a seller's market.
I see now lot of youngsters, they are in their CVs, they are mentioning about their GitHub and providing their GitHub access. And this is something, once you see that, you instantly know that, whom are you talking to and what kind of personality you are talking to. And it changes the entire, the conversation and the mindset around that person. So I think sharing your GitHub, the kind of work that you are doing and small innovative projects you are doing, I think this is a wonderful advice to all the youngsters to include it in their CVs actually.
Yeah, I think Shivam is asking, and I think Shivam, you are right. Adding value to an open source project, you are an open source developer. And I think that's a good way to think about it. There is another question on purchase the license dependent on OSS, then start charging. See, I think this is, the question basically goes to, should you buy open source software? I know a lot of organizations which are using CentOS and other software, and that decision of, should you buy supported open source software depends on the criticality of the infrastructure that you're running. So for example, if you're Bombay Stock Exchange and if your system is down for even 1 minute, what that means is that you are assuming, a tremendous amount of liability for, transactions that are not completed, etc. So this is where the criticality of open source, supported open source comes in. I'll give you an example. When I was talking to some of my friends and they said, I just can't talk to you right now because I'm working night outs because there's an insurance company that has used unsupported open source software. They thought they were taking a backup, but the backup was not working properly. So they were 3 days and nights to restore the entire database. Otherwise, if your insurance policy was in that database and that database had crashed, you would not be able to, you would have serious problems making a claim. Right. So this is where supported comes in. I think with open source, you have the choice of doing your own support, or you have the choice of hiring an organization for support. Vineet, I'll have to drop off in a minute.
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yeah. I would love to talk more, but sure. I wish I had kept an eye on the time, but
no issues. I will share your details and your presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'll pass it on to you. And thank you very much, Venkatesh. We thank you from all our heart for being available and helping the young people understand what open source is all about.
Thanks. Thank you very much. If you want me to join this forum again, I'm happy to.
Sure.
Maybe in a few months' time, I'm happy to.
Right. Yes, we can do that. Thank you, Venkatesh.
I'll leave more time for question answers.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Venkatesh.